Welcome to our webinar series. Today we are delighted to welcome Professor Gordon Bloom, who's, as you know, probably the director of the thematic initiative Health and Wellbeing at the University of Portsmouth. Gordon has a very impressive track record. I don't really like this word, but it says what it says. He's been doing some research work from the moment he got his PhD at the University of Leeds. Then he moved to UCL, where he spent over 25 years as a biomedical engineer. During that time with UCL, he worked at the Royal National Orthopaedic Hospital, where he developed and translated a number of orthopedic implants into clinical practice. He's been rewarded for this work. He got a very large number of publications, over 200 peer-reviewed scientific papers, a number of book chapters. He supervised more than 30 PhDs and other students. He's someone who's very, very active in terms of research. He managed to get a massive number of grants. And today we are going to address the question of public health policies in relation to the COVID-19 crisis, obviously, but not only, from a more general perspective. So without further ado, I'd like to give you the floor, Gordon. Everyone, please mute your mics, and when you have questions to ask to Gordon, please use the chat bar so that I see your question and ask them to Gordon. The floor is yours, Gordon. If you want to share your presentation, you're most welcome to do so.
Okay.
Superb.
That's the wrong thing. We just had this, right?
You have your emails now.
Yes, I know. Let's just get rid of that. Let's just see where I am. Yeah, sorry, I didn't have this open.
No worries. Yes. That's perfect. Now we see your presentation. Excellent.
Okay, great. Is this okay? Can you hear me, Layla? I guess everybody else has their microphone turned off. So good afternoon, everybody. And Layla, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to give a presentation on COVID-19. Well, I'm going to start with a picture of the coronavirus. And as you can see on the left-hand side, it's really small. This is 120 nanometers in diameter. And just to put that into some form of context, if you stack this up a bit like you would a row of snooker balls, diameter to diameter, then you'd get about 8,000 of these particles per millimeter. So they're really very small. The science behind the way this virus attaches to cells, the way that it gets inside of the cells, and the way that the cell biochemistry replicates the virus is really quite complicated, and I'm not going to go into that at all. It's just very fascinating. So this is a small particle, of course, but it's caused significant disruption to our lives, and much more importantly, it's caused morbidity and mortality, particularly mortality, within our community, which is, of course, catastrophic. So I'm Gordon Bloom. I'm the Director of Health and Wellbeing, and I'm going to talk about the government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm not going to go a lot into the science, a bit into the science, a bit into the public health issues, and a bit into the issues associated with how the UK public has reacted to the government policy. So hopefully there'll be something in here for everyone. So we're all now experts on COVID-19. We have listened to the news. We've become armchair epidemiologists, armchair immunologists, and armchair virologists. And never before have we been so well informed about the disease. And I think this underlines two important things, or the disease, COVID-19, underlines two important things. I think it underlines the importance of science in our daily lives. And I think particularly it underlines the importance of key workers in our daily lives. I mean, we all go out on Thursday evening at 8 o'clock and clap for these key workers. Well, I just hope that the esteem that we currently hold these people in outlasts this pandemic, and hopefully we can rebalance our society a bit, where we can improve the working conditions and the remuneration of these key workers. That's a hope. So I just want to sort of put this into some form of context, and I want to start by saying hindsight is a wonderful thing. Now, this is a quote by William Blake, who is an 18th century English poet. And everybody knows about what hindsight is a wonderful thing. But it goes on in this quote to say, but foresight is better, especially when it comes to saving lives and reducing pain. So the distillation of this talk is that I think the UK government, with hindsight and with some foresight, could have handled the pandemic slightly better than it has done. So I think it could have started social isolation earlier, which would have reduced the deaths associated with COVID-19. If you think about it, when we were starting to lock down at the end of March, people had just attended Cheltenham, the Cheltenham Horse Racing Festival. I think there were about 125 spectators at that festival. And what that did, it resulted in a peak of hospital admissions and deaths in the local hospital in Gloucester about 2 weeks after the Cheltenham Festival. But around the same time, there was a football match, a European Cup football match in Anfield in Liverpool. And that was with AC Milan. And AC Milan brought over about 3,000 spectators. And of course, Milan was a centre for the development of COVID in northern Italy. So probably by starting the lockdown a bit earlier, we could have reduced the effects of COVID-19. We should have also adopted Germany's approach of extensive testing, and probably with hindsight, the government should have stockpiled personal protective equipment. And I think that the government will in future keep huge stocks of personal protective equipment, because these pandemics are likely to happen again. So the government are taking advice from the best scientists in the country, and they're trying to implement the strategy that the science dictates. Interestingly, some of the scientists aren't taking their own advice, as we hear from the news today with one of the advisors visiting his girlfriend. But I think we should remember that this is a new disease. It's only been around for about 5 months. And sometimes the science is lacking, and sometimes the science is contradictory. And with any academic study, whether it be in science or in the arts, it takes time to actually investigate the issues. So this is really early days in a new disease process. So why did the UK not act sooner? Well, I think to a certain extent, early on, the government was being advised not by scientists, but by political representatives who were talking about herd immunity. And this is where the resistance to the spread of a contagious disease in a population needs to be resisted by the individuals that have developed immunity. And that's okay if you have a vaccine or a treatment, but COVID-19, as we know, doesn't have a vaccine yet, and it doesn't have a proper treatment, which means that in a population, if you wanted to instill immunity, people would have to catch the disease. People would be ill with the disease before they became immune. And it's calculated that with the R of COVID, the reproduction rate of COVID, the number of people that one person affects at any one time, which is 3 in the natural population, you would need 70% of the population to be infected and to become immune. 70% of the population would become ill with COVID-19. And that would result in a mortality rate of around 1%, that would result in around 400,000 deaths. So herd immunity was never on the cards. And of course, it's no longer being talked about. The alternative is to isolate and to stop the spread by bringing down this R. And that's exactly what the UK government have tried to do. And the UK government closed everything down on the 23rd of March. And on the 26th of March, they introduced what's called a statutory instrument, which is a legal document which allows people like the Prime Minister and the Health Minister to make laws. And these particular laws were aimed at so-called flattening the peak and limiting the spread of COVID-19. It gave police powers to enforce the social distancing rules, to restrict movement, to close businesses and disperse gatherings. And of course, it has reduced the R down to about 0.7, and it's reduced the number of admissions to hospitals. But on the other hand, it has also resulted in an increase in mental health issues, in domestic violence, in child abuse. There have been effects on homeless people. There's been an increase in alcohol consumption. There has been added issues associated with mental and physical disability. And this has also affected other treatments because patients no longer want to go into GP surgeries or into hospital to have other conditions attended to. So these are very important factors. And I think that if you are interested, you should look at 2 documents which are available on the internet. One is the Liberties document, which is briefing about the statutory instrument, trying to adapt it slightly. And the other one is a letter to the government written by Disability. Interestingly, the statutory instrument is about to get an airing in the Houses of Parliament tomorrow. It hasn't been yet discussed within Parliament. So this is a discriminatory disease. We know that older people in our society are more susceptible than younger people in our society. However, I think it's even more discriminatory because of our society. The elderly, who of course are at greater biological risk, are even more susceptible, especially if they're in care homes. And the reason for that is that the UK government has sort of slightly ignored them and not delivered PPE to the carers in those care homes in a timely and an effective manner. The BAME community in the UK is around 3.5 times more likely to die from COVID-19. This may be associated with the biology of the disease, but no one is that sure, and there are studies going ahead at the moment. These individuals, however, are more likely to be frontline key workers, and often they have an incidence of predisposing health conditions as well. So the higher mortality problem may be associated with incomes with people in the lower income bracket. These people often live in poorer, more crowded housing. They may live in regions where there's high air pollution. Some parts of Portsmouth are a good example of this. And we know that regions of high air pollution affect the respiration. And this is important in COVID-19 disease. People often in low-income brackets can't work from home, and they need to make a living, and they often do jobs where social isolation is very difficult. This is a contentious point, and it may be that less well-educated people are not able to understand or interpret all the information. Deliberately put a picture of Donald Trump up there. In other countries, not in the UK, there have been protests associated with the lockdown. So in the United States, for example, in April, there were protests in a number of states, and these protests were supported by right-wing armed groups, religious fundamentalists, and groups that didn't believe in vaccination. The radical right, in other words. And even in Germany, on May the 2nd, there were protests and a number of people were arrested. In the UK, maybe we don't protest as much as other European countries, but there's been no instance of any protests. And maybe that is associated with the information that we're getting from the media, which I think is exemplary at the present time. Some things are really quite complicated. Simple things such as, should we be wearing face masks? Initially, the government advice was that there were no use to prevent the spread of COVID-19. But this is contradictory. So it may be that they're good at preventing onwards transmission. People suggest, the Prime Minister suggests, that they may be good at instilling confidence. I don't really see that myself, personally speaking. I think the opposite may be true. Indeed, it's much more difficult to communicate with people wearing face masks, essentially because you can't see their expressions of emotion. And these face masks may be taken away from people in the front line who need to use them for PPE. The other issue is where do you get them from? I have absolutely no idea where I would get face masks from. And some of the designs are less than useless. Some of the designs are very good, but some of the designs are less than useless. In the early days, in fact, even in Portsmouth, there was a bit of a backlash against people wearing face masks. This may have something to do with the fact that these people originated from Asia, where it's more culturally acceptable to wear face masks. So if simple things like wearing face masks are really complicated, what about issues associated with testing? They're even more complicated. So this is about testing to show the disease. And of course, this is in the news at the moment with the trial that's going on in the Isle of Wight. If you're tested positive, what do you do with the results? Well, of course, you isolate. Up to now, there hasn't really been an effective tracking and traceability associated with those positive results. But now we have this development of the app, and of course that's causing concern regarding GDPR and data protection. And Amnesty International have highlighted this, saying that it may be pervasive surveillance. It may infringe privacy, and it could lead to potentially discrimination of groups within our society. The response that the Health Secretary gave the other day to Amnesty International's statement was a bit sort of dismissive. He said it was completely wrong. Well, it's not completely wrong, because that data, or some of the data, is going to be logged within a central database, and there's no information at the moment on how that data will be protected. They say that it is going to be protected. Do we rely on their opinions and not, how do we know that it is going to be protected and not hacked? So what about antibody testing? I think that is also slightly contentious. One is the reliability. Until recently, some of the tests were really poor and were only 60% reliable. In fact, I heard that the government bought tests from China where the reliability was around 60%, spent a lot of money on that. The antibody tests obviously locate antibodies in your bloodstream to indicate that you have developed a reaction to COVID-19, to the virus. However, those antibodies may not indicate that you have any immunity to the disease. If you have immunity to the disease, nobody's sure how long that immunity lasts for. And I can imagine in the future that you'll have two factions in society. One where you have a positive antibody test, which may or may not indicate immunity, but that antibody test, if it's positive, could go on to suggest that you may be able to lead a normal lifestyle, whereas those people that don't have antibodies in their bloodstream may be susceptible to infection, and they may have to continue to socially isolate. Indeed, it may be that they need to catch the disease. Of course, this will have huge social implications. Interestingly, the frequency of these diseases is likely to increase. I don't think this is going to be new, and therefore I think the government in future should be prepared for new pandemics. So far this century, there have been 3 pandemics. Two former ones were both associated with a coronavirus, rather similar to the coronavirus associated with COVID-19. There was something called SARS, which was an outbreak in Asia, very similar to COVID-19. It caused more mortality, but it was less infectious than COVID-19. The SARS outbreak was controlled by isolation, essentially, and by tracking and traces. In the UK, we were sort of immune to this because I think we only had 4 cases and all of those recovered. Middle East respiratory syndrome, MERS, also known as camel flu, is again quite similar to coronavirus, and 36 people died in South Korea during the MERS outbreak. South Korea were interesting because the population has a population of 51 million, not so far removed from the population of the UK, but they put in place controls to combat the MERS outbreak. And I think they learned lessons from that MERS outbreak. And so far, although they have had 1,000 cases, there's been much fewer deaths associated with those cases than there has been in the UK. So I think South Korea learned their lesson, and when they got COVID-19, put in place a system of track and tracing, which was relatively strict, and they sort of have almost defeated this disease. Close to home, and I think this is where we should look, we should look to cases such as Germany, cases such as Greece. Germany has a similar number of cases to the UK in terms of testing positively, but they have a remarkably low mortality rate. And they attribute that to the fact that a large number of these cases are associated in a younger population than in our population. They attribute that to tracking and tracing, and actually taking the people that test positively to actually treat them early and defeat the disease in these individuals. So I think lessons are to be learned from the way Germany has dealt with COVID-19. So this is my final slide. Just checking the time here. So has the government got it right? Well, I think it depends on what price you put on the safety of you, your family, and others. And I think it's a balancing act. You can have isolation, testing and tracking, and maybe in the future antibody testing, which sort of gets rid of the of COVID-19 in our population. But on the other hand, that also affects our civil liberties, and that's important. If you don't do as much isolation, testing and tracking, the mortality rate may increase, but our civil liberties will be less effective. So I think, has the government got it right? I think it depends on your own perspective. Thank you. Layla, we can't hear you because your microphone's off.
Sorry, thank you very much, Gordon, for this really fascinating presentation. I think everybody has a lot of questions because it's really very important, and it's science, but also, as you all understood, public health policy. Again, I'm going to use my privileged rights as the chair to ask the first question while others are preparing their question. But I really like what you said when you started your presentation about the fact that everybody's become some sort of armchair virologist. So we have lots of knowledge now about viruses and pandemics and DNA of it, and questions we were never asking ourselves before. So on the one hand, I suppose it's very positive because it's a way to responsibilize people. And on the other hand, it's a bit tricky because it's also fear and confidence, as you said at the end of your presentation. So do you know another period of time, and I was thinking about maybe the beginning of HIV/AIDS, maybe where we got, or at the time we got that much information and everybody had an opinion on science and how to use it? That's my first question. And second question, which somehow relates, which is more philosophical question, but I think very important, and you started to ask yourself about it as well. In terms of somehow values, why is it that we put health at the top level, at the top of the pyramids of values, if you wish? Because we could think, or we could say and think differently in thinking, well, the mortality is not that high compared to a number of other diseases. Maybe health is not the very priority. The priority of a society is to make people free, let them do what they have to do, and not necessarily make sure that they don't die, because death is part of life as well. That's my second question.
Okay, can I start with your first question, your second question, because I can't remember your first. I think it depends on your own personal circumstances, actually, the value that you put on health. I think it depends on essentially not only you, but also the people around you. So I can imagine that if you have an old mother or father, for example, you would be really quite worried about them catching the disease. And I think that will have adjusted your opinion about the balance between freedom of expression, freedom of speech, well, not freedom of speech, but sort of civil liberties, and the restrictions associated with isolation. So I think it's essentially a personal thing, and I think that that opinion will depend on your own circumstances and whether you have relatives who are more susceptible, or people that are, or children, for example. If you think about football players who are meant to be going back to playing football, training in isolation, playing in isolation. I've heard an article on the news just the other day that they were worried about their families. So, you know, these people get paid huge amounts of money to go and play a game of football, and yet they were still worried about their families. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I'm going to play the devil's advocate. However, I understand what you say at the very individual level, but however, at the state level, at the level of a government, it's slightly different. What sort of priorities do you have? And it's beyond the COVID crisis. How come we maintain very old people in care houses while these people are not in a very great physical state? You know, what sort of value again do we put forward? You see what I mean? So Michel Foucault, the philosopher, had in sort of discussed the idea and created the concept of biopower in the 70s. So I'm sure you know about that. To make it very, very simple, it's just the fact that health become the very most important element of life. It might not be right.
No, I'm sure that. So, speaking personally as somebody that has a relative who has dementia, I think, and um, uh, quite severe dementia, it's sort of not good to see the way they're looked after, not good to see their quality of life, and indeed, if they were um, uh, fully compos mentis, they would say themselves that this was not the way they wanted to live their lives. I mean, we're getting into a different sort of argument here, and that is about what do you do? How do you not take care of those individuals? And I think that's a really difficult thing to do, principally for various reasons. One is that um, you presume you love your family, of course, but also things like poor health doesn't necessarily happen all of a sudden. It creeps up on you. So when do you make the decision not to look after them? I think that's a really difficult decision. And uh, yeah, I sort of agree with what you say that health, irrespective of the, so really, if you are in poor health, at what point do you think that your quality of life is no longer worth living? That's a really, really difficult question to answer. A really difficult question to answer.
Thank you so much, Gordon. It is, and this crisis again is asking us a number of very profound ethical questions, really, and they are difficult to answer at the individual and at the state level. We have a question for Marta. I'm just reading the question for you. We have been all overwhelmed with scientific information interpreted by journalists and politicians. What can we do as scientists to make sure the scientific information is related to the public correctly? In many cases, preliminary results are advertised as certainties. How can we educate the public to be careful of these interpretations?
Okay, so I think that I put a slide about education up there a bit, and I put a picture of Donald Trump. I mean, when you think about what he said regarding disinfectant, which he then sort of withdrew slightly, saying that this was just a joke. It obviously wasn't just a joke. So that sort of thing um, doesn't do anybody any good. So I think we have to be really careful about who we listen to. I think we have to be really careful about interpreting newspaper reports. And this is a new disease, which makes it difficult because what you would really like is scientific evidence, which has been collected over a period of time. It takes time to collect that scientific evidence to produce what's called a peer-reviewed article. So I think the best thing we can do is listen to the scientific experts. Now, I know, Layla, you would say that those scientific experts are sort of biased because they're working essentially for the government. But I think that's the best we can do at the present time. We need to listen to those appointed scientific experts rather than, you know, reading everything you do on the internet or on in newspapers. But I think the proof of the pudding will be, you know, down the line a bit when we get proper scientific evidence. I hope that answered your question, Martin.
Thank you very much, Gordon. It most probably has. We're going to then open the floor to more questions. We have a question from Karen. What do you think about the rumored plan that young children will be the first to go back to school? So it's happening in a number of countries, but it's quite problematic or controversial. Does it make sense to stagger returns to normality like this?
You're going to have to, I think, for two reasons. One is that, of course, there's lots of people saying that young children don't get COVID-19 or the symptoms that they get are very much reduced compared to older people, which is really great. But then you have teachers teaching those young people, and that's important. That's the fact that I think that you are going to have some form of social isolation, particularly with older pupils, not necessarily with young pupils, because I think that's going to be really difficult to do. But I think that it has to be done on a staggered basis, and I don't think we have the resource to have everybody return to school at any one time.
Thank you so much, Gordon. We have another question here from Joe. The government response has been led by the Department of Health and Social Care, yet, like you say, the later part of that has been somewhat neglected. For example, care homes being forgotten, PM expressed regret today, and domestic issues rising. Do you think this pandemic and the impact it has will start to bring social and primary care closer to the level of the secondary hospital-based care? If not, what will?
I think Joe, hello, Joe. I think it will, and I think that's a really good thing. So, you know, I don't think we are going to be able to sustain another outbreak like this ever again. You know, it's almost ended our society to a certain extent. Certainly, it's really affected our economy. So I think the sustainability of how we're dealing with this outbreak is not good. We're not going to be able to sustain another epidemic like this. So I think that our primary care situation has to improve significantly. And I think we are going to have to invest more in healthcare, more in primary care. We are going to have to invest in stockpiles of antiviral drugs. We're going to have to invest in stockpiles of PPE. We're going to have to invest in more doctors, more nurses, more GPs, more people in the community. So watch out for your tax bill.
Indeed, thanks very much, Gordon. I think this is the shocking part for most of them in the, you know, biggest democracies, most advanced, so to speak, countries in the world, in the UK, in France, in Germany, even if Germany is a bit better, but not that great. We are discovering for some of them, I think, not everyone, that the health system was very bad. But when I say discovering, we knew that before. So how do you think it's going to play? Because it's a political choice, really. So how do you see a reform, a profound reform of the health system in our countries?
Okay, so how is it going to reform? I think it is quite an interesting question, actually, because think back to the general election where the issues associated with running the health service was sort of a paramount and a really important discussion between people like Jeremy Corbyn and the Conservative Party. To a certain extent, I think that that discussion has now gone away because the Conservative Party, whether they were going to or not invest in the NHS, are going to have to invest incredibly more in the NHS. They've already cancelled debt for NHS trusts, so they are investing more in the NHS. And I think that we cannot sustain another pandemic like this from an economical point of view. So it's sort of very important that they develop systems which are able to deal with pandemics like this. I think there'll be more pandemics. You know, we've talked about coronavirus. Fortunately, it seems to be quite stable, but the coronavirus associated with SARS and with the camel flu has not yet had a vaccine produced. So if this thing sort of mutates like flu does, it's a different class of virus, flu, but if it does mutate like flu does, then we may well be faced with, you know, another pandemic quite soon. I hope it doesn't. But I think that the NHS, the health service, not just the NHS in the UK, but the health services throughout the world are going to have to bear that in mind.
Absolutely, Gordon. And we have a question from Dee, which relates exactly to what you said. She asked, vaccines are cited as the way out. How likely to be successful are the vaccines currently undergoing clinical trials, particularly considering the recent media report suggesting we may be able to vaccinate the UK population later this year? Is it true, or is it more like some sort of, you know, nicely put together propaganda?
Okay, so this is a really important question, and I wish I had a crystal ball, Dee. But if you look at evidence from coronavirus outbreaks, which are very similar to COVID-19, the SARS and this camel flu outbreak, which happened in 2004, I think, for the SARS, and 2015 for the camel flu, there has not yet been a vaccine developed. Now, I'm not saying that the vaccine won't be developed, but they've had a longer period of time. The only thing that we're doing now, of course, is we're ploughing a lot of resources into developing a vaccine for coronavirus, especially because it's a much more common disease. So I would like to think that a vaccine will be developed. I'm not holding my breath. I think alongside the vaccine as well, though, are treatments associated with COVID-19. Things like plasma from patients that already had the disease, things like antiviral drugs, and things like, you know, vitamin C. They've all been suggested that they have a positive effect. Getting back to Marta's first question, we have to wait for the reports of the clinical trials to see whether they are positive or not. So I would like to think that a vaccine can be developed. Certainly a huge amount of resources being ploughed into developing one, much more so than with the previous COVID-19 outbreaks. We're just going to have to wait and see.
Thanks so much, Gordon. We have two very interesting questions again. From Karen, do you think this may be an excuse to disband the NHS? So we're going back to more public health question.
Okay, the answer to that question is I hope not. In fact, I would suggest that it's going to be exactly the opposite. It's going to be, I think the NHS needs strengthening. So you could imagine that, well, in this current crisis, right, the largest effect of COVID-19 was felt initially in London. And in London, we built this new Nightingale Hospital very quickly, which fortunately now is becoming more and more redundant. But before that, we were sharing equipment between hospitals. We were transferring patients between hospitals. We completely reorganized elective surgeries in all these hospitals. Now, if the NHS hadn't been effective, I think we wouldn't have been able to do that. And if we have individual hospitals that are, you know, sort of like orthopedic hospitals, I think that will be a negative for dealing with subsequent COVID outbreaks. So no is the answer to the question. I hope not.
Very good. Another political question from Marta. Do you think a coordinated response from the EU from the beginning would have been beneficial, knowing that we're not exactly in the EU, are we? I don't know.
One of the things that, of course, we talked about just before we started was the discussions regarding Brexit have all gone away. However, I believe they still want to do Brexit in December, which may be difficult. But yes, I think that that is really important. And I wish we had, I wish we had a Brexit referendum again after the COVID-19, because we're not going to do that, of course. But I think investment in the way that we treat these pandemics is really important. And I don't think any one country can afford to, you know, invest in just treating this in isolation. And the reason for that is that you waste an awful lot of money in terms of resources, in terms of equipment, in terms of knowledge associated with one particular country that needs to be replicated not only in Europe but across the globe. I personally think that it has to be done on a European basis. I don't know how that's going to pan out with Brexit, but I still think we should endeavour to do this on a European basis.
Thank you so much, Gordon. We have time for a few more questions. I'm going to ask one. What about this disease that we are now hearing about, this Kawasaki disease? The minute children might go back to school, we hear about cases of this Kawasaki disease in England, in France, in Spain, in Italy. What is that? Do you think it relates, and why is it happening now?
Yeah, so there's been a number of sort of diseases which have sort of been suggested to be a result of COVID-19. So, for example, a number of patients have developed brain associated disorders, which is believed to be associated with the virus. A number of other patients have developed sort of pulmonary conditions associated with poor circulation associated with the disease. So I don't really know how important these are. I suspect that they are associated with COVID-19. The incidence of these again will have to be measured properly in academic studies.
Of course. Maybe one last question from our colleagues. In any case, I have maybe the last one. You were talking about sustainability and the very fact that we might have new waves. It's not going to disappear like that. We might have new pandemics. So how do you see, precisely because we can't probably repeat, we can't sustain lockdowns like this, how do you see the daily management of the next few months, be it with or without new crisis?
So I think I think that we will, like all countries in Europe, we will slowly come out of lockdown, and that will be a sort of a stepwise release of the measures, and that will be associated with tracking and tracing with this app, which I think everybody will be using or may be using. And hopefully that won't result in any new peaks in COVID-19. I think, though, that there'll be, of course, more admissions to hospital, not greater admissions, but more admissions to hospital. I'm not sure that it's going to completely stop. I think we will trickle along the bottom. And if you get an admission to hospital and you get COVID-19, it doesn't really matter when you get it. It's COVID-19, and it still has an effect on you as an individual. So I think any COVID-19 disease is bad, but I think we will have COVID-19 trickling along the bottom for a little while.
Thank you so much, Gordon. Do we have more questions, or do we have comments from colleagues who are working on the issue or who are not working on the issue? You might know that the University of Portsmouth has elaborated quite strong response to the virus in a number of disciplines. Not only are we supporting the making of face masks, but a number of us are working on science of the disease, the DNA. Others are working on the economic, the political, the human rights consequences. So it's also interesting to see that science at large is coming back very much into the picture and is seen as extremely important today, not only so-called hard science, but also social sciences and humanities, to address these issues, which are extremely important for everyone. So if we don't have more questions, we are going to bring this session to a close. I'd like to really warmly thank Gordon for this really very, very interesting presentation, and invite you to come on Wednesday next week. We're going to have a colleague, Henry Pierce, talking about data protection and privacy in relation to the crisis, but not only. And in any case, every Wednesday until, for now, at the end of June, but probably later, we have a webinar. So you're most welcome to join. Thank you very much again. And thanks very much to Gordon for this fascinating presentation.
Thank you very much, and everybody keep well.
Keep well.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.